Amber Littler is a physician assistant at the Hotze Health and Wellness Center. Having worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a number of years, Amber feels fortunate now to have the opportunity to practice natural approaches to health rather than merely masking a patient's symptoms with dangerous prescription drugs.
Hello, my name is Amber Littler. I'm a physician assistant at the Hotze Health and Wellness Center. Today I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about ideal eating plans that you can follow in order to fight aging. You know, a lot of times we think about all kinds of things that go into the aging process, but a lot of times diet doesn't factor into that. So why is your diet important when we talk about aging? The main thing that really has an impact here is inflammation. That's really what it's all about. You know, it's widely recognized these days that most degenerative diseases that we develop as we age have a root in inflammation, and inflammation has a root in diet. So there's a significant connection there. You know, 24% of us in the United States are dying from cardiovascular disease. 23% of us are dying from cancer. And then you have other things like strokes and Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and arthritis, all contributing to our demise, but all have roots in inflammation. So if we can control that, then we can control the aging process there too. So why do we get this inflammation? There could be several reasons that are related to diet specifically. Obviously, thyroid problems or hormone imbalance or other issues can contribute there. But specifically around diet, you could be looking at a food sensitivity. Maybe you're allergic or intolerant of something like gluten or dairy or even sugar that you don't realize, and it's creating inflammation in your body. Yeast overgrowth in the gut. You know, if you've ever taken antibiotics, steroids, birth control pills, then you have a yeast overgrowth in your gut, and that needs to be cleared out. All that yeast stuff in there is producing a lot of toxins that are then being absorbed into your system and creating this inflammation. Being overweight and obese, and of course in our country that's incredibly common at the moment, is creating more inflammation. Elevated blood sugar and diabetes. Diabetes contributing again to about 3% of mortality in our country right now. And then processed food additives, you know, these chemicals and all of the artificial things that are in all of these boxes and bags and cans and everything that we're buying in the grocery store, all of this stuff again leads to more inflammation. So the question often comes up, well, there's so many diet plans out there. What's the best diet plan for me? If I want to slow down aging or I have a specific need that needs to be addressed, which diet plan should I follow? So what I've done here is kind of a step-by-step guide for you, and we'll find the best plan for you as an individual, because this is not cookie cutter and every diet isn't going to work for every person. So when we talk about optimal eating, what I think of with optimal eating is the sort of diet that really everybody should be following. These are general guidelines applicable to you, young, old, you know, doesn't matter, healthy, sick. So basically vegetables needs to be the core foundation of your diet. Organic if possible, if that fits in your budget. You know, if that doesn't fit in your budget, which it doesn't always fit in mine, and that's okay. So what you do is you go online and you look for that dirty dozen list and at least buy organic of those things, or don't buy them at all that month if that's not in the budget. Stick with the other vegetables and fruits that tend to be cleaner, obviously making sure you're washing things properly and that sort of thing. Moderate to low sugar fruits would be best options when it comes to fruit. Things like bananas, grapes, tropical fruits like mango, pineapple, all very high in sugar. And you can have those, but you probably want to limit the amount of those. Stick more with fruits like berries and apples, oranges, things that are lower in sugar would be better for you. Lean, unprocessed meats. Again, organic, grass-fed, if that fits in your budget, do the best you can with that sort of thing. When you can afford to buy that month, buy it. And the other months, don't worry so much about it. You know, you don't have to lose sleep over this. Just do the best that you can. Little to no simple carbohydrates. So we tend not to recommend people eating a lot of sugar, bread, pasta, rice and potatoes, things like that. I mean, white rice, you know, the simpler carbohydrates. Those things really just kind of turn into sugar in your body and again, lead to that sugar issue, the diabetes, the inflammation, etc. Little to no added sugar, of course. Now with this, especially refined sugars, you've got to watch this closely. Sugar these days is added to everything. You know, you go to your local grocery store and it takes me 20 minutes now to find a spaghetti sauce that doesn't have sugar in it, or a salad dressing without sugar in it. So trying to avoid those sorts of things. As we mentioned, the artificial things, the colors, the flavors, the sweeteners, preservatives, trying to avoid those things. And the best way to do that is really not spend an hour in the grocery store in those middle aisles looking for something that suits, but instead sticking to the outer sections of the grocery store where you can buy fresh, whole foods and concentrate your diet around those things rather than looking for a box of something that's going to fit, because you're just really not going to find it. So no soda. You know, sodas are full of chemicals, phosphoric acid, which eats away at the bones. Lots of big reasons to avoid sodas. Of course, there's the sugar, the diet sodas. You've got the artificial sweeteners, and the studies are actually now showing that people that drink diet sodas actually weigh more than people who don't. So really avoiding those altogether. If you really have to have your soda fix, you know, every once in a while, then I'd go for brands like Zevia. There's a couple of others on the market, but those are more natural sodas. They're sweetened with stevia, which is a much safer alternative than your aspartames or sucralose or things like that. You would want to try to limit caffeine. Now, this doesn't mean you have to be caffeine free, but you don't want to be living on coffee all day long. That has a big adrenal impact and also dehydrating to you. Now, green tea might be an exception because of the antioxidants in green tea, and that's really could be good for you. But again, especially if you have adrenal fatigue, too much caffeine is really going to make that harder to heal. Limiting alcohol. Again, not being a teetotaler, you don't have to avoid alcohol completely. But on average, women should not be drinking more than 1 drink a day. Men should not be drinking more than 2 a day on average. So limiting to that or a little less would be best for your overall health. Of course, limiting your canned foods and other sources of BPA and other chemicals like BPA that are added to the can linings. These things are what are called xenoestrogens, and basically what that means is it's a chemical that's in there that acts like estrogen in the body, and it creates estrogen imbalance in everybody. But one of the big hormone issues that we fight in our guests here, and that can be lessened by avoiding those xenoestrogens. Limiting your processed foods, again, if it comes from a box, a bag, or a window, it's probably not the best idea. So no fast food. Also, there is some thought that it's probably best to avoid the microwave in general. In my house, we have a microwave, and you know, I use it to melt a little butter now and again, that sort of thing, but I'm not cooking meals in that microwave. They just really don't have good data on what that radiation is actually doing to our food and then how that's affecting us. And so really, until we know for sure, right now the data is pointing towards it might not be best to really live on microwaved food. So I would limit that. Now, that was everybody. So what about if you are part of everybody, obviously, but then you also have some blood sugar problems? What else should you do on top of that optimal eating plan to prevent aging? Well, anyone with insulin resistance, diabetes, or an elevated hemoglobin A1C. The hemoglobin A1C is that stands for glycosylated hemoglobin, is another name for it, and it's kind of a 3-month average of what your blood sugar's been doing. And any problems in any of that area, you should be doing these additional things. And that is strictly avoiding sugar in all its forms. So instead of being moderate about it and watching your sugar intake, you really should be avoiding sugar. And now this includes natural sugars like honey, agave, maple syrup, things like that. Those are all still sugars. They do occur in nature, but as far as what happens in your body, the impact on your blood sugar is the same. You also want to strictly avoid carb-based foods. Again, we're talking about bread, rice, pasta, potatoes. So instead of, again, being moderate about that everybody should be doing, these folks really are going to want to avoid that completely. Limiting your fruit, so even more so than we did on the last slide, these high sugar fruits like bananas and grapes, mangoes and things really should be avoided completely. And then you should limit quantities of better fruits like berries and the apples and things like that. You still don't want to be eating that by the truckload. Avoiding fruit juice for sure. Fruit juice is basically sugar, is what it is. You know, when you take a look at a glass of orange juice compared to an orange and the sugar content of those two, it's dramatically different. And you should be sticking with whole fruits and not the juices. And then again, on the alcohol, little to no alcohol here. Alcohol does turn to sugar and promotes high sugar levels in the body, and it's not where we want to go here. Now, what if I have cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular risk on top of the being everybody? Maybe you've got the blood sugar problem too, and now you have this risk for cardiovascular disease. As you can see, these diets, you can kind of tack on each one. But for folks with cardiovascular disease or even risk for like high blood pressure or a family history of early heart disease, or maybe you smoke and things like that, and your risk for heart disease is higher than average, then we would want to do some studies that look at your actual risk, like your carotid intimal medial thickness scans. That looks for inflammation in the carotid arteries. Heart scans can be done, looking for calcification of the heart, and even a procedure called max pulse, which is where they put a little clip over your finger and you sit still for about 3 minutes, and then it comes out and tells you what your arterial elasticity, or the stretchiness of your arteries, looks like. And that's an indication of how healthy those blood vessels are. The more stretchy they are, the younger, more healthier that they are. So any of that testing can actually be done here in our office, and we can give you a better idea of your cardiovascular risk, and then you know if you need to do a program like this. The main diet that we would recommend for cardiovascular risk is the Eat to Live program by Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Now, this is quite a lot more extreme than the other slides that I was showing earlier. This is really a plant-based diet. So you're concentrating on eating all vegetable sort of things and some fruits, nuts and seeds, beans, things like that. There's no animal protein in this diet, so you would be avoiding meats and eggs and dairy and things like that. He also has you avoid some of the higher fat things, saturated fats and things. There's actually a documentary that's based on a similar program. It's called Forks Over Knives, and you can find that, I believe, on YouTube or Netflix. You can watch Forks Over Knives. It's a really impressive documentary showing actual reversal of coronary artery disease. You can see it on the imaging study that's done. You can see that blockage, and then the person goes away and does the diet for a period of time. They come back and they re-image them, and it's gone, and they haven't done anything else. So it really does display for you the power of this diet. Also, it's beneficial for you to increase your intake of nitric oxide boosting foods. So nitric oxide is a substance that's formed by the artery walls that is a vasodilator. In other words, it makes the blood vessels expand and they carry blood better. So you get better delivery of blood to the heart, the brain, other important areas in improving your cardiovascular risk. So you're looking at things, specifically beets. Beets is one of the best things for nitric oxide, but also nuts, brown rice, artichokes, kale. Kale is famous for doing this too. So if you hear a list like that and you think, oh, beets, those are nasty, or kale, I don't like that, then you can try and incorporate these things into your diet in kind of creative ways. I'm not a particular fan of kale myself. I don't like to sit down and just eat a bowl of it. But what I do is I buy raw kale and I chop it up and I mix it in with my normal salad greens. Then I never even know it's there, but half my salad is made up of kale. But mixed in with the other vegetables and the other greens, I don't really taste it. And with beets, if you grew up with your mother making beets and you always thought they tasted like dirt, then you're probably having boiled beets and canned beets and those sorts of things, which I don't think are as good. What we like to do at our house is we buy fresh beets and we cut them in half. We toss them with a tiny bit of coconut oil, a little salt and pepper, and we roast them in the oven. And they're absolutely lovely that way, very tasty. And I think you'll find some creative ways for cooking these sorts of things if you do a little internet searching and find a way to incorporate these in a way that you like. Okay, so what if there's a suspicion you have a yeast overgrowth? As I mentioned earlier, anybody who has taken birth control pills, steroids, or antibiotics in the past, which, who hasn't taken antibiotics? The likelihood is they have a yeast overgrowth in their gut, which may or may not be symptomatic in the gut. That's the interesting thing about yeast, is you think, well, my belly feels fine. I don't think I have a problem. Well, those yeast are in there making toxins, and those toxins are being absorbed into your bloodstream, and they could be affecting you in ways you don't realize. Some people will report headaches, or they get joint pains, or things that go away when they do this yeast cleanse, and they're really surprised about it. Sometimes you don't actually feel anything, but there's underlying inflammation in your body. It might show up on blood work, it might just show up years later with damage that now we can't undo. So yeast cleanses are important for everybody to do as a baseline. After that, you should repeat a yeast cleanse if you have to take antibiotics again, or if you start getting stomach-related symptoms. So gassiness, bloating, belching, things like that, especially reflux. How many people out there are on these proton pump inhibitors like Nexium or Protonix, Prevacid, Prilosec? those medications taken long term really create a lot of problems. In fact, there's a study that recently came out showing a 20% increased risk of heart attacks and cardiovascular disease in people who take those medications. So we want to try and avoid those at all costs. And really, it's just a Band-Aid. If you're trying to suppress acid with a medication, why not get to the root of what's causing that acid in the first place? And that's this yeast overgrowth. So you can do this cleanse. Non-starchy vegetables, nuts, beans, lean cuts of meat, and eggs kind of form the foundation of this. You'll be avoiding dairy, you'll be avoiding grains. Again, that famous carb list that I mentioned, the bread, pasta, rice, and potatoes, those sorts of things you'll be avoiding. It's also important that you avoid vinegars. Now, funny enough, this is the hard part for me because I love balsamic vinegar. But you can have apple cider vinegar, so you can make salad dressings and incorporate that instead, and it's a good substitute. And that actually doesn't stir up the yeast like balsamic vinegars and other vinegars can do. You'll be avoiding all sugars. Sugars and simple carbohydrates just feed the yeast, and then they just keep flourishing. So you'll want to avoid all of that. So for the first month, it's stricter. You will be avoiding strictly all the potatoes and rice and the flour and dairy and that sort of thing. After the first month, though, in the second and third months, you can loosen up a little bit. You could add in small amounts of sweet potato, brown rice, maybe a little bit of unsweetened Greek yogurt, those sorts of things. You can add it in small quantities, especially if you're not trying to lose weight. If you're trying to lose weight, I would continue to eliminate some of those things. But otherwise, some of this sort of stuff added back in moderately in the last couple of months still seems to work fine. Now, what about gluten? The catchphrase of the year, right? Everybody's gluten-free, and everybody knows about gluten-free stuff these days. So really, who should be doing this? Should everybody be on a gluten-free diet? I don't know, maybe. But really, I tend to encourage my guests who have any kind of neurologic problems, any kind of neurobehavioral problems, so things like ADD and ADHD. I encourage those moms to get their kids on gluten-free diets. Autoimmune diseases, for sure. There is a lot of data linking autoimmune problems with underlying gluten intolerance, and pulling the gluten out can actually improve that dramatically. In fact, that's my personal story. I was diagnosed 20 years ago with lupus. I was treated with all kinds of medications, and I never really got healthy. And it wasn't until I came here and I got my thyroid straightened out, I got my hormones in balance, and I got off the gluten, that now all of my symptoms are gone. I'm off of all of my medications, and my blood work went back completely to normal. My blood work hadn't been normal in 20 years, and now it is. I take nothing for lupus. I just don't eat wheat. Easy, right? So it becomes worth it when you've got something like that. Psychiatric issues, people with anxiety, depression should have a good gluten-free trial to see if that helps. And then also any kind of unexplained chronic inflammation, so even inflammation that's showing up on blood work, the doctor gets back that elevated CRP and just tells you, well, there's some sort of inflammation, we don't know where. I'd be avoiding gluten and see if that calms things down. And then iron deficiency anemia is definitely linked to gluten intolerance when there's no other explanation for it. So what does going on a gluten-free diet mean? Well, let's start with what gluten is anyway. Gluten is a plant protein, and it's found in a few specific grains, wheat, barley, and rye in particular. Now, of course, you've got to remember then the derivatives of those things will also have gluten. For example, malt is a derivative, so it is a gluten containing thing. And then a lot of people say, and sometimes oats. So they say this list of gluten things are wheat, rye, barley, and sometimes oats. Well, what does that mean? Sometimes. Sometimes it has that protein, sometimes it doesn't. Oats actually don't naturally contain gluten. The problem with oats is they're almost always processed in plants that process wheat flours. So there's a lot of cross-contamination there. You can find a lot of oats on the market these days, though, that are certified to be processed in plants that are gluten-free. So you're much safer with those. But oats themselves don't contain it. And then, as I mentioned, you've got to watch for hidden sources of gluten. So you can be doing great avoiding bread and pasta, and you don't think you're getting any wheat, and you go to the sushi place and you're eating your rice and your ahi tuna and you're pouring soy sauce all over it. Well, that soy sauce is full of wheat, so you're getting the gluten there. You've also got to watch for it in beers. Beer has gluten in it too. There are other alcohols that are safer, your clear spirits, wine, things like that are naturally gluten-free. There are some gluten-free beers on the market. If you're really going to miss that beer on a Saturday afternoon in the park, then go for a gluten-free beer. Give that a try. So what happens if I have a gluten sensitivity and I ignore it? And I think, well, I don't feel that bad, but so the doctor tells me I have this little bit of inflammation, but I'm going to ignore this. I'm going to eat gluten anyway. It's not worth it for me. Well, here's what the data shows. The Mayo Clinic did a study in 2009 and showed that people that had underlying celiac disease, in other words, they had damage in their gut from gluten, if they remained on gluten, they didn't go on a gluten-free diet, they had a fourfold or 400% increased risk of dying from any cause. 400%, that's huge, absolutely huge. In 2009 also, in Sweden, a study was done. Now this one's interesting because it showed a 35% increased risk of mortality after 7.5 years. So that first study was over 45 years. That was a big follow-up study. This second one's only 7.5 years. They're already at 7.5 years showing 35% increased risk of mortality. Now here's the interesting thing. These people had gluten sensitivity. They did not have celiac disease. In other words, there was no damage in the gut. The gut was fine. What they saw was blood markers. They'd have a blood test done and they had antibodies to gluten, but they actually had no provable damage to the gut like celiac disease people have. They still had a 35% increased risk of all-cause mortality after only 7.5 years. These mortality risks go away if you avoid gluten. Easy fix. There's no medication, there's no vitamins you need to take for this. You just need to get off the gluten and the problem goes away. So what if you have other food allergies? So I tend to talk about gluten separately because there's a lot more risk involved with gluten than there is with some of the other things. But if you have other food allergies, say to dairy or nuts don't make you feel so good, that sort of thing, the way that you can figure this out is you eliminate some of the foods that you suspect might be bothering you. You see if you feel better. After a period of a couple of weeks, you can add those foods back in, see if you feel worse again. Now, I would advise you add those foods in one at a time, of course, because otherwise you won't know which one really is bothering you, and it might not be all of them. So you'd eliminate, say, dairy and nuts and, I don't know, maybe eggs, and eliminate all three of those. A couple of weeks later, try an egg, see what happens. Give it about 4 days. You can react up to 4 days later. So eat eggs for a few days, see how you feel. If you don't notice anything, well, you can probably eat eggs okay. It won't be a big deal for you. Then add in nuts, see how you do, etc. Go on that way. It's called an elimination reintroduction diet, and it's kind of the gold standard for figuring out food allergies. Now, you can have blood testing done that will look for antibodies to specific foods. In fact, the test we do here in our office tests you for 184 different foods, and we can tell you if you have antibodies to these foods in your bloodstream. Now, don't misunderstand, that doesn't mean you're allergic to these foods. It doesn't even mean you have to avoid all of them. They may not actually make you feel bad. What you have to do is take that information then and apply this elimination reintroduction diet and see if that food actually makes you feel bad. The exception to that one being gluten, of course. If that shows up on that test, you're done with gluten because of that 2009 Swedish study that showed people with antibodies alone have this increased risk of mortality. Now, the one caveat to this is if you've ever had a severe reaction to food, say you ate a piece of shrimp in 1990 and it landed you in the hospital, you never try to reintroduce that. That's called a fixed food allergy and it never goes away, and it's not even dose dependent. So you don't have to have the whole platter of shrimp. You can just have a little taste of it and you'll end up back in the hospital again. So never, never tempt it when you've had a serious reaction to food. Okay, what if you need to lose weight? We may fit into some of these other categories, but then we also go, well, I'd like to lose some weight too. Well, these diets help me lose weight. Well, we generally recommend a low-carb diet for losing weight. The problem with carbohydrates is not just in their calorie content. When you eliminate carbs, it's not just about lowering calories. What's really happening there is you're lowering the insulin in your body. When your blood sugar goes up, you make a hormone called insulin from your pancreas. Insulin's job is to lower blood sugar and control it. We all know diabetics or have heard of diabetics who have to give themselves insulin shots to control blood sugar. Well, here's the thing. The way insulin works is by signaling the body to get that blood sugar out of the bloodstream and store it in the fat. So insulin is a fat storage hormone. As long as you keep that hormone high, you're not going to lose weight the way that you'd like to. You'll lower the carbohydrates, the insulin comes down too. Now the body's not getting that signal anymore, and you can lose weight with proper diet and exercise then. So yeast-free diet that we do here, like I went through earlier, is automatically low carb, of course. Paleo diets, if you don't need to do a proper yeast cleanse, then you may not have to be quite so strict with things like the vinegar we talked about. You could do something like paleo. Now, you have to be careful with paleo and other caveman-style diets because they allow natural sugars. So some of the paleo recipes I'll come across online will have honey or agave in there. I'd still recommend that you avoid those. Sugar's sugar. It's still going to spike that insulin level. You're still going to get that signal to store fat, which is not what you want to do. The Eat to Live program by Dr. Joel Fuhrman that I talked about on the cardiovascular slide, that's also a great weight loss program. That's a plant-based diet. People lose weight doing that. That's another good one. Intermittent fasting is another program. There's a book called the Fast Diet, and he's not talking about fast as in quick, he's talking about fast as in fasting. And intermittent fasting is based on this conception that you're throwing the metabolism off, and the body never really knows how many calories it's going to get on any given day, and keeping the body off balance, according to this doctor, will spur your metabolism into gear and help. So his basic premise is that you eat normally for 5 days. Now, of course, I'm still going to advise that you eat healthfully for 5 days, and then 2 days a week you restrict the calories down. I believe it's a restriction down to 800 calories, maybe 500 for women, but it's a significant calorie restriction for 2 days a week. The rest of the week you don't worry about calories so much. Now the final one, and honestly one of my favorites, is the Weight Watchers program. Now I don't particularly like their processed foods. I think that just replacing all of your ice cream with Weight Watchers ice cream or your bread with Weight Watchers bread is probably not the best way to do this because you don't really learn how to eat properly doing that. But what Weight Watchers does do is it keeps you accountable. Every week you've got to go up to a meeting and you've got to get on a scale in front of somebody else so that they can keep you accountable for what you're doing. You're also surrounded by a group of people who have the same struggles that you do, and they'll give you ideas, and you just know that you're not alone and there's some support there. So I think that that's a great program too, and you can basically take any diet program and do it while you're doing Weight Watchers. So for instance, you could do a low carb program while you go to Weight Watchers, and Weight Watchers is simply helping you keep your portions down and teach you what more appropriate serving sizes look like and that sort of thing. So that can be really helpful too. I think we're done. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of a few things that you can do to help prevent aging as you adjust your diet and live longer but live healthier. And these are some easy changes that I think anybody can incorporate. I hope that's given you some good information, and thanks for paying attention today. Bye-bye.